From the Internet, the International Jack Benny Fan Club presents the 4th Annual Jack Benny Convention.
We're in for quite a treat because we're actually going to be going over to an interview that Walden, Hughes, and I conducted with Rich Correll, son of Charles Correll, who actually got to know Jack Benny a little bit in his childhood and shared a lot of his reasons why Jack was so influential to him as a fan of comedy and an eventual director. So without further ado, Mr. Paul Kovitt, give us some Rich Correll.
Hi, everybody. I'm Walden Hughes and Rich Correll. Welcome to the Jack Benny Convention.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
For the audience who may or may not know, your dad was Charlie Correll of Amos and Andy fame.
Right.
You are definitely a family historian. Was that always part of your DNA as a kid? Because you always seem to be interested in your dad and his career and the people he knew and just the historian of Hollywood.
Yeah, I was the youngest of 5 kids in my family. And for some reason, I was kind of the family historian, even at a young age. I was the guy who really wanted to know about the dates of my father's show and the time and the guys he worked with, the comedians he knew, the movie stars he knew. I was fascinated by all that stuff. I always thought that the history of Hollywood was really, really interesting. And I was kind of somebody who wanted to be entrenched in that, not only meeting a lot of these people who actually made the history, but, you know, kind of appreciating what they did. So even as a little kid, it was kind of strange. I was always the guy that was saying to my dad, what year did you do this? And when did you move to CBS? And who did you know at NBC? And it was great. And the thing is, Jack Benny, and I'm not just saying this because it's the Jack Benny broadcast, but Jack Benny was my favorite comedian. I always thought he was really, really funny. And he spent a lot of time with us. He would come over to the house for dinner with Mary Livingston. And we used to see Jack quite a bit. And I would go up and talk to him about various things. And he seemed like just a normal guy, not really doing his shtick or anything like that. But then sometimes at dinner or something, if he would ask for something and you didn't have it, and maybe he would ask for something that he knew it wasn't there, then he'd do the whole, he'd do the face. He was really funny and he was very droll. And so I always thought he was really, really funny. Some of the best nights we had at the house when people like George Burns and Jack Benny were there in person. George Burns once kind of like sat me on his lap, and Jack Benny was there as well, and said, do you realize how big a star your dad is? He said, there was a time in radio when there was all of us, and then there was Amos and Andy. And Amos and Andy was kind of like up here, and the rest of us were kind of down here, hoping we would get to the fame and the recognition that Amos and Andy had on the air. And at one time, Benny said that his ambition was to follow the Amos and Andy time slot so that people would be listening to Jack Benny. Now, of course, Jack was really, really good, had a great show, was extremely popular, but he was just being nice. But the two of those guys together were really funny, but Jack was always my favorite. He was always a really good friend of Dad's. And as you know, they worked together a couple of times. And those shows that they did were the Amos and Andy show that Benny did in 44 was one of the better shows. That was really good. And then the Benny show that Amos and Andy did in 1950 was really good. And the funny thing is I ended up working with Milt Josephsberg, who wrote so much stuff for Benny, and he remembered that show vividly and said they really had a lot of fun doing it. So I was really lucky. I was around Milt and Harry Crane and Charlie Isaacs and people like that who were guys that did a lot of writing for Benny. So I kind of knew that whole community of people.
You think your dad and Jack connected because they were both from Illinois? And any ideas why they connected so well?
Well, Dad was from Peoria. Jack was from Waukegan. I think that was kind of a running joke with them, the boys from Illinois that did well. But I mean, Dad always had a lot of appreciation for other people on the radio. If you had a good show, my father didn't act like, oh, well, you're in competition with us. I mean, I saw him sit down and listen to these shows, Jack's show in particular, because it was both, on radio and then later on television. I saw him really laugh at stuff that Jack did. So he was a good audience for Jack, but he was a very unselfish performer because he encouraged and really promoted and really liked a lot of other comedians, other shows. And I think that's really great. You know, one night was really cool. CBS, I think it was doing a kickoff, like it was Jack's premiere. I don't know if it was a premiere of a completely new Jack Benny show or just the beginning of a new season. But they watched Jack's show. I did. I watched it with my dad and my mom. And Dad, after the show, Dad got on the phone and like dialed this number. He almost knew it by heart. And it was Jack's number. And he called him Jackson. A lot of people call him Jackson. Don Wilson in the show from time to time would call him Jackson. And so would Phil Harris. But that's what a lot of people call him in real life. And my dad called him and said, Jackson, you got a great show. Good for you, man. This is going to run a long time. I think you look great. The show's great. And it was just sweet. It was really nice. And I think that Jack appreciated that because he respected my dad and certainly respected that what their contribution to radio was.
I think for people who may or may not know, your dad was more outgoing than Freeman was. Did Freeman, would he be part of the dinner parties, or would that basically just be a separate setup? You know, your dad had his friend and Freeman had his group of friends.
Dad did have a lot of his own friends. Now, Freeman was, you know, obviously very, very close to him. They were partners for 55 years. And so he always respected Freeman. He always came to parties and things like that. But Freeman was a much more reserved person. And by the way, my dad said that Freeman was extremely creative. Like he was the most creative of the two of them. And so my dad gave a lot of credit to Freeman to not only deciding to walk away from WGN in 1928 when Sam and Henry was a hit, and Freeman wanted to expand, and WGN didn't want him to expand. And so Freeman said, let's walk away. Dad gave him a lot of credit for that. And he also said he came up with a lot of crazy things, you know, Mystic Nights of the Sea and the Fresh Air Taxi Cab. A lot of that, he said, was Freeman's ideas. And then remember, when they wrote their own show and they did it 5 days a week, they would pace back and forth and kind of bounce jokes off each other. And he said that Freeman could come up with great stuff, great ideas. He could look at the newspaper and come up with stuff from the newspaper and daily events that Amos and Andy could talk about and get all twisted up and stuff. But he said he was really a talented guy. But he also was less outgoing than my dad. My dad was kind of like the life of the party. He had a piano every place he went and would sit down and play tunes for people. And people really loved him. And Freeman was a lot more reserved and quieter.
If you analyze the success of Amos and Andy, what do you think it was, Rich? Were they the first one to really have a situation comedy that people follow? What if you analyze their success, what do you think it would be?
Dad always said that one of the reasons they were so popular was because they got in early. They were the first. You know, there was a time, Walden, when going to the movies in the United States meant you either went to see Charlie Chaplin or Mary Pickford. And there was a time in the late 40s when buying a television meant you were going to watch Milton Berle. And just the same as that, in the late 20s, there was a time when buying a radio or a crystal set meant you were going to listen to Amos and Andy. So they were huge stars, but they said that part of that was because they got in early. The other thing that they said was really key was that they created these characters that people cared about. They were careful to make them believable characters. They had good morality to them. Amos was a good family man. People pulled for them. And so he said that that really, really, really helped them. It's that the public loved them. And the thing is, they also had not only legions and legions of fans. At the time, the census of the United States was 140 million. There were 55 million people a night listening to them. So that's a third of the whole country. But they also said that what was really great about that was that everybody seemed to get involved in their personal lives and everything else, the characters. And he said because people loved them so much, they wanted to know what they were going to do. And they were concerned if something bad happened or, you know, they lost money or their business was going to go over. There was a time when my dad said to Amos, I feel terrible because I don't have any pencils. I'm a big businessman, so I got to have pencils. I got to write stuff with pencils. And there's no pencils around here. They made kind of a joke about it. And, you know, within the next 2.5 weeks, he received something like 3 million pencils that people sent them. And then when they did the thing about name Amos's baby, the post office had to set up a substation. They got so many letters about this is what you should call a baby. And people acted as if Ruby was really pregnant and Amos was really going to be a dad, and it was all fiction. But they created these characters that people loved. They not only thought they were funny, but they were involved. The audience was involved with them. And I think that was a big thing too. That was really smart on both of their parts. But I think that's what worked out great. But again, Dad said that, and the fact that they were the first ones in, because everybody listening to the radio started listening to Amos and Andy. He said that was a big help. They were the kind of original pioneers. They had the first strip show, they had the first sitcom, and they had kind of the first soap opera, except it was comedy.
You think then because of that, Rich, they influenced people like Jack Benny and George Burns? Those guys came from vaudeville. And let's face it, Amos and Andy were the hottest thing on radio. And I'm wondering if they would have influenced Jack and George to have, cast members that people became aware of, or became familiar with. They knew Dennis Day and Mary and Rochester and Phil because the personalities. And I'm just wondering if that is a way for them to, they took it from Amos and Andy in a way.
Yeah, Burns and Allen and Benny were really creative guys, people. They, I don't know. I think they may have said, there's characters there's a character that's grounded. There's a character that's kind of naive. There's a character who's a shyster. There's a character, and they may have been guided by that a bit because they were the first. But Jack was always a really, really good comedian. And if he didn't do the writing himself, he had good writers around him that understood that. And certainly Burns and Allen. Burns and Allen, I don't think needed help from anybody. I think they were just really, really good on their own.
I can't remember if it's in Jones' book or if it's in another one, but it's been a definite statement by Jack how big a fan he was, not just of your father and Freeman's work, but specifically the scripts and how they were written and constructed. And given Jack's meticulous nature over his scripts, I wonder if it's a matter of not so much influence, but it helps him recognize strong characteristics that build a believable character, as opposed to just necessarily taking traits of the Kingfish or Andy or anybody like that. He just understands okay, if I can get a character as strong as Kingfish to come across in my program, then I know I've got something reliable for the next 39 weeks or how many weeks the show is going per season. Did Jack ever refer to his adoration of the scripts for you, or was it just your dad is really big? We hope you know that.
No, I don't think I think it's the latter. He talked about how successful the show was and that they kind of ushered in the way for the other guys. But, you got to remember what's really interesting, much like the Harold Lloyd movies, and we were talking about that earlier. You got to remember that Jack and George and Gracie, even Jim and Mary and Jordan, those guys were really the last word on what was going on with their shows. The same thing with Edgar Bergen and Bob Hope. People, the staff of writers would come in and pitch them stuff. They'd pitch them the shows, the plot of the show, where the funny stuff would come through. And Jack and George and all those other guys, they were really the guys who had the final say about that. So when you look at a show like Jack Benny being as funny as it was, both the TV and the radio show, an awful lot of credit goes to Jack because he really knew that character and he knew what was going on. And I think he knew to surround himself with these characters that not only kind of ingratiated themselves to the public, but that were really funny as well.
That's a very fair point. I find it interesting when you brought up the Benny program that your dad and Freeman were on. I believe it's the How I Met Rochester episode. The writing is so tight that two different shows are blended so seamlessly together. And that whole sketch about them basically hawking them Rochester over to Mr. Benny is so tightly constructed that you would believe that these two different shows existed in the exact same world. I feel at no point in that episode that I don't believe that the Amos and Andy world can't blend into the Benny world.
You're absolutely right. I mean, and the writers, like when they went over to do Benny, the writers were primarily the Benny writers. They weren't the Amos and Andy writers. I mean, obviously, the Benny writers, again, I think kind of spearheaded by Milt Josephsberg. I believe that's who it was. But those guys, you know, had been listening to Amos and Andy for years, but went in and did their research, listened to what was going on in 1950, which was, of course, a lot different than what Amos and Andy was doing in 1930 or 38 or 42. Or, I mean, they listened to what was going on. And then they brought Amos and Andy in and wrote material. And my father and Freeman, just like Jack, had to sit in judgment of that material. And they told me that when they got there to do the Benny Show, the script was almost performed as written the first time. So, I mean, that's really, really, really a good tribute to the Benny writers, because those guys were really good.
You talked about Jack being like probably your favorite. Can you quantify, both of it as a historian but also as a fan, what it is about Jack's comedy that sticks out to you as an appreciator of his? Like, what is it his personality that he exudes on his show? Is it his ability to edit a script? What is it for you that sings the loudest?
That's a great question, and I have an exact answer for you. I can tell you exactly what it is that puts me away, even when I see Jack these days, when I see reruns or something. Jack was the best reactor to what was going on around him than anybody I ever saw. And when I ended up directing, and I was directing for almost 40 years in television, I would say to the people I'm directing, especially if they were kids, and I did a lot of kids shows, I said, look, you guys, I want you to act in the cracks. And what that means is, if it's not your dialogue and you don't have that scripted line, stay in the scene. Because for me, the funniest guys are the guys and the women who are reacting to all the crazy stuff going on. Jack made a movie in 1929 called The Hollywood Review of 1929. And he introduced Laurel and Hardy. Now Oliver Hardy was the king of reacting to what Stan was doing. Hardy, even in the silent days, starting in 1926, would look in the camera. When something was going wrong, if he was looking over here like this at Stan, he'd look right in the camera at you. Now that puts me away. And I love Stan. Stan was a friend of mine, actually, but it puts me away. I think it's so funny, and nobody could do it better than Jack. That's why one of the most famous radio gags in the world is a silent gag that Jack Benny came up with when the guy said, your money or your life. Well, you know what he's doing. He's standing in front of the studio audience reacting. And those reactions made him the most valuable comedian. You guys, a comedian who can stand on a spot, make a face and react without talking for a minute and get those kind of laughs is the most valuable comedian in the world.
Yeah, and to add to that, I've been researching Jack's film career in various forms over the last 3 years. Not only are you correct about reaction, but I think it's Stephen Weiner talked about the art of reactive comedy as it pertained to Be or Not to Be. But I took it into another stratosphere in my thinking with things like Buck Benny Rides Again or anything he was in with Eddie Anderson. There are funny shots and there are not funny shots. The not funny shots are singles on either of those gentlemen. The funny shots are a 2-shot or a wide shot. Nothing at all funny comes from those single shots, apart from maybe the line itself. It's watching those two interact uninhibited on a locked off 2-shot that manages to be hilarious. And in To Be or Not to Be, they do the same when it's Robert Stack, Carol Lombard, and Jack all in the apartment, and he's hearing the entire plot up till now, and you're just watching his head turn back and forth, trying to suss out what's going on between Robert Stack and Carol Lombard before he finally interrupts. And it just it builds and builds to the point where he finally just expresses out loud, like, all right, I don't know what's going on, but I'm going to figure it out, and then I'm going to yell at both of you later.
He was absolutely the best. I was always trying to figure out whether in 1929, because that's an early appearance of Jack's, but I was always trying to figure out, did he steal the slow burn for Hardy, or did Hardy steal it from him? Either way, they both put it to good use, but man, no one was better than Jack.
No, not at all. And I actually that the production of Hollywood Review fascinates me because Bessie Love's Bessie Love's memoir basically pontificates on the idea that Jack was very interested in special effects and Black Velvet process shots. And I'm like, that is interesting for a young man from Waukegan to just be like, how are we gonna take Bessie Love out of my pocket? How are we gonna do it? So,
Talk about Milt Josephsberg a little bit, Rich. What's your memories of him?
When I was at Paramount, in 1977, I arrived at Paramount and I started working for Gary Marshall as a music coordinator. And luckily for me, in about 6 months, Gary's sister, Ronnie, not Penny, but the older sister, she was producing Laverne and Shirley and Happy Days. And she said to me, we want to make you associate producer of Laverne and Shirley. Now, first of all, associate producers are people that take care of all the post. And everything in those days was posted on 35 millimeter film. And I had a lot of background thanks to my experiences with Harold Lloyd in film restoration. I had a lot of background in film. So I was like, oh my gosh, Laverne and Shirley, sure, it's the #2 show in the country. And I was just in the right place at the right time. Well, a couple years in, Gary, who loved old time writers, decided he was going to bring in some punch-up guys. And one of them was Milt. And so Milt, who was a sweetheart, just a great guy, he came in and, I knew who he was. And I knew he had a background in radio. So whenever I could, I'd get a chance to kind of sit down with Milt and go, hey, Milt, so working with Benny, can you tell me a little bit about that? And he said, yeah, that was a great experience. And Jack knew what he wanted. And, we'd sit down in the writer's room. Unlike Jack's persona, Jack paid really good money to these guys to write him jokes and things. But he said that, Jack was really, really, really nice. And he said that, I asked him specifically about Amos and Andy stuff. And he said that was actually an easy one to write because most of the staff knew their material. We listened to some stuff. I told you that earlier. And then when we gave it to him, it was just automatic. They were pros. They had, done 7,000 shows or something. And they were really, really, really ready to go. And he said it was great because the audience had so much fun with them. Milt was a super nice guy. He brought in Harry Crane. Harry was another super nice guy that not only had been a punch-up writer for a lot of these radio shows, but had worked on the Amos and Andy show, I think around 1943 when they first were starting the half-hour shows. And Harry told me specifically he remembered a show that they did with Peter Lorre. It was called Trunk. So I said to Harry, you know what? I think I have a copy of that. But then I kind of downplayed it because Christmas was coming and I got Harry's name in the Christmas pool. And the Christmas pool was everybody, around Happy Days and Laverne and Shirley that worked for Gary. You just randomly drew names and I got Harry. And so what I did was I made him a cassette of the Trunk show that he had written with Peter Lorre and Amos and Andy. And he literally flipped. I don't think he had heard the show since it was done live. He had no idea that he was talking to somebody who had a copy of it. And it was Harry's show. But Milt was like that too. Milt was a guy who remembered everybody. As an older guy at an older age, seemed very vital, appreciative, loved Gary, loved Jack. And he loved talking. He always liked talking about that. And there were a lot of young people at the studio those days. It was kind of like Jack Benny radio show or Amos, not me. No. When those guys came in, those were the guys I wanted to talk to. So I have nothing but great memories about Milt and all those guys. And I thought it was fantastic for Gary to hire those guys. Very, very smart because look, these were the best comedy writers in the business. Because they were a little bit older, weren't they funny? Of course they were. So, keep going.
Why did your dad and Freeman decide to stop writing? Was it because they got so busy during the war? What was the background for them to decide we're going to hand it off to other people?
Well, what happened was in 1928, they started on the NBC Blue Network, and then that took off. They started in 4 eastern states. That took off big, and then they were biked around the country. And by 1930, they were like the biggest stars on radio. Actually, by late 29, that was NBC. So they stayed on NBC and they kept working on NBC until 1938. And then in 1938, they went over to CBS basically to do the same thing. It was a strip show, 15 minutes daily they were on. And they were getting tired. I mean, they wrote every single word and played every character except female characters that you ever heard in the show. So then hiatus came along in late 42. The war was on. But they also pitched this idea. NBC came to them. David Sarnoff came to them and said, "We want you to go back to NBC. Can we steal you away?" And they said, "Yeah." And Sarnoff said, "What do you think of a show in front of a live audience?" And they said, "Well, that's great, but we cannot do that every day. There's just no way, especially being a half-hour format. We can't write that much." And they said, "Okay, we can bring in a team of writers to help you." And of course, Freeman said, "Well, that sounds like a good idea, but of course, Charlie and I have to approve all the writing and the writers." And that's basically what they did. And they did that from 43 to 48. And then 48, CBS bought the rights to Amos and Andy. They sold out to CBS and then stayed on the air on CBS from 48 to 60. So, I mean, that was an amazing run. But the thing about, to answer your question, it was just a matter of kind of the logistics of doing a half-hour show. The fact that they had been writing for the first 15 years for, I mean, every word, and they were a bit tired of it. And the fact that they had this idea, along with Sarnoff, actually, that radio should become a sitcom in front of a live audience. And they were like one of the first shows to ever do that. I don't know. I mean, you guys would know more because you're historians, but I don't know how many people were doing shows in front of live audiences before that time. But that appealed to them because they loved the laughter of the audience, and that worked great. But that's how it worked. They didn't have the time to keep writing a half-hour show. Because remember, you guys, when they would get together, much like a sitcom that's shot, they would come in on Wednesday. They'd go through the script that was there at the table. Freeman and Dad would give notes, write some of their own stuff, tell the writers punch it up. They'd have another run at the table on Thursday, which was like a network run, much like we did sitcoms. And then the next day would be the day they go on live in front of the audience, which would be Friday or Sunday or whenever it was. So, I mean, it was always a 3-day process, but the writing was going on all the time. And when they weren't in the room, even if it was a 3-day process, it was a weekly process because all those stories had to be broken and punched up and fixed up in the first 2 days before Correll and Gosden sat down at the table. And the funny thing is, everybody, in a way, people were afraid of people like Gosden and Correll and Burns and Allen and Jack because they wanted so much to please these guys. They knew what they wanted. And sometimes they could be really tough. But my father, unlike Gosden, was never like nasty or tough to the writers. If he didn't like something, he would say, "You know what? It's so great. We're almost there, but let's make these changes." Where Freeman would go, No, I don't want to do that." And I'm sure Jack, who really knew what he wanted, was a bit more like Freeman. So, I mean, I can remember Gary Marshall used to walk around and say, "Look, if you have a better joke or you have a better way to fix something or you have a better line for the Fonz or for Laverne or for something like that, don't be afraid. Come on up and give me. I may not use it, but don't be afraid. Just come on up and give me." He said, "But never, never, never say to me, 'Oh, that isn't funny. Oh, that doesn't work.' You better have the fix. Have the fix. Even if it's wrong, have the fix and pitch it to me." And I think that's a lot of how Correll and Gosden and Benny worked. You know, have the fix, bring something better, let's go. That's what the staff of writers did. It was a fantastic process.
I was just thinking about Conley and Moser, of course, wrote Amos and Andy for a while. And, of course, you worked with them on Leave It to Beaver. Any memories of those two guys?
Yeah, my father met Joe Conley at the 1939 New York's World's Fair. He was an usher. And he came up to my dad and said, "Oh, Mr. Correll, I aspire to be a writer. If I ever came out to like Hollywood, would you ever listen to or look at my stuff?" My father, he probably heard that 100 times. And he said, "Oh, sure, kid, yeah, I'd be happy to do that." Sure enough, a few years into the show in front of live audiences, Conley came up with Mosher and submitted some material. Came on to, my dad liked it. He showed it to Freeman. The other guys liked it. So they brought them in kind of as junior staff writers and moved them up. By the time 1948 came around, and the CBS, thing took over, or they moved to CBS. Conley and Mosier were the head writers. So Joe Conley loved my dad. He loved my dad and always was grateful that my father remembered him from 1939 and also, gave him his big chance as a writer. Because as you've just said, I mean, they went from writing radio, and obviously Amos and Annie was a big hit. They went from that right into making the shows at Universal, the most famous two of which were Leave It to Beaver and the Munsters. So, and I was there through that whole process because Ricky Conley was Joe's son, and that's the kid that Beaver was fashioned and modeled after. He was exactly my age. I think I was 2 months older. We were classmates. I knew him forever. And so I knew everything that was going on in the Conley house because I not only saw Joe at the studio when I was doing the show, but I saw Joe at home all the time because I was over visiting the Conleys. Rick was like my best friend, so I was there all the time. That was lucky too, learning from those guys.
So is that partly how you got on the show? Because you and Joe hung around a lot, so that they thought it'd be a good fit?
Well, there's two reasons that I think I got on the show, and this is being completely honest. Joe always carried around a little notebook, and he was always asking me and Ricky, what do you guys like? What TV shows do you look at? What kind of stuff are you interested in? What sports do you like? What movies do you like? Because he always wanted to know, he kind of keep his hand on the pulse of what kids like. So he saw me running around with Ricky a lot. And then what happened was on Leave It to Beaver, they decided to replace Beaver's best friend, who was a guy named Larry Mondello, who's played by an actor named Rusty Stevens. And so they said, let's have auditions. So my agent called and said they're looking for kids to audition for Leave It to Beaver. And I thought, that's great. I mean, Joe didn't send for me. I went in on an audition like 10, 12, 13, 15 other boys to be somebody like, Beaver's age, who could be a friend of his. And so I passed the audition. I did pretty well. And it wasn't until I was like in the final running for that show with maybe two other kids that Conley actually was aware that it was me that was auditioning. And then when he came in for the final reading, I believe, he didn't say this, but I think it was, he saw me with Beaver the way he saw me with Ricky, his son. And he said, let's hire this guy. And the really interesting thing, Walden, was that the original character I read for was a guy named Sam or Tom or something like that. And when the final script came down, the first show I ever did, the character's name was changed to Richard. Now, I think that was Conley's influence for sure. But I mean, that was really cool. And then I worked for Conley for a long time, and he was happy. He liked my acting. He thought it was great. I can remember one time we were doing a show, and Jerry, that show was a 5-day process. There would be a table read on Monday, a rehearsal day on Tuesday where you did run-throughs for the producers. And then you would shoot on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, and Thursday was always out in the back lot. So that's when we were on Colonial Street and shooting at the Cleaver House or whatever sets had to be on the Universal back lot. And I was doing this one particular show, and Jerry was sick. He had like the flu or something. And they said, well, we don't want to lose the week. Let him stay in bed. They called in on a Saturday and said he was sick. And he said, let him stay in bed. And Joe Conley said, bring Rich in and let him play Beaver. He can play Beaver on Monday and Tuesday, like for the run-throughs. And it was the craziest thing because I was like Beaver for 2 days with Barbara Billingsley saying to me, now Beaver, how are you handling this thing at school? And Ward going, come on, Beaver. Now, you have to get along with your brother. But it was me. They were talking to me. It was like, and everybody had watched Leave It to Beaver. So I was kind of Jerry Mathers for 2 days. And that was really fun. And that's because Joe said, look, Rich will do great for the run-throughs. Just bring him in for 5 days. So that was cool.
What about Harold Lloyd? Did Harold Lloyd know your dad before you worked for Harold? What's the background, how you got to Harold Lloyd?
Harold Lloyd was a very good friend of my dad's. What happened was during the winters in the 30s in Chicago, when it was like, 12 degrees below zero and the wind blowing, both my dad and Freeman lived on the lakefront. So this was one of the coldest places in the United States. They hated the weather. And Freeman would like get these headaches from bad weather. So they decided we're going to change up and go someplace during the winters. And they ended up in Palm Springs, California, which was gorgeous. NBC set up a broadcasting booth for them at the El Mirador Hotel. They actually broadcast out of the tower of the El Mirador Hotel, which is the only part of it that's still left. I just saw it a few months ago. But they went down to Palm Springs, and there was a community of people in Palm Springs, which was Charlie Winninger, Al Jolson, Ruby Keeler, Harold Lloyd, Marlena Dietrich. There was just a lot of people, a lot of film people that would come down there a lot. Spencer Tracy would be down there, Cary Grant. And that community of people, everybody knew one another. So my dad met Harold Lloyd in like 1934, and then knew him for easily 4 years in Palm Springs while they were still broadcasting, before they moved Amos and Andy from Chicago to LA permanently. They moved out permanently in 1937. So my dad was, a good friend of Harold Lloyd's. And then in 1940, Paul Whiteman, Bing Crosby, Harold Lloyd, and Correll and Gosden decided to start KMPC Radio, which was a huge station in LA. And they were the founders of it. So my father, again, was seeing Lloyd quite often, and they were really good friends. And then later on, Harold Lloyd, who became the leading stereo photographer, 3D photographer in the country. I mean, this guy shot 500,000 slides. I'm not exaggerating. He started a society of people doing stereo, realist, and 3D stuff. And my dad and Art Linkletter would become some of the founding members of it. That brought them back up to the Lloyd estate, working with Harold and everything else. I met Harold in 1966. And when I introduced myself to him, I said, I'm the son of Charlie Correll. And he was, oh my gosh, I've known Charlie for 30 years. I mean, it's like, this is fantastic, So they were good friends. And my mom told me, and my dad said, we used to drive by Harold Lloyd's house in Beverly Hills, and I would say, what is that? Because you couldn't really see the house, but you saw this huge property. It was 17 and a half acres, and you could see some of it from the street. I said, what is that? And they said, that's the home of Harold Lloyd. And I didn't know. Well, who's Harold Lloyd? And they said, well, Harold Lloyd was one of the biggest stars in Hollywood and one of the highest paid stars ever. He saved his money and he built this great place. And they said, and I'll never forget this, they said, and by the way, it couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. He's the nicest guy. They told me that years before I met him. So I never forgot that. And then, I ended up being his film curator. I had the key to every door in the house. He was literally one of my best friends. I was much closer to him than I think my dad ever was.
So being a fan of Jack's, as you are, could you ever break it down to a favorite episode of radio and or television that stands out to you as like your favorite, or at least the best example of what Jack brought to the comedy world?
Well, I'm biased. I love all this that they did with my dad. My dad had such a good time with Jack, and I'm biased, but I have to tell you that, just like most of the public, some of my favorite moments on all of Jack's career were the shows he did with Mel Blanc, who I just, so funny. And again, as we spoke about, what a reactor. Because, Mel would do these crazy things, see, sue, sigh, all that stuff. And Jack, those routines were doubly long and doubly funny because Jack reacted to them. And so those were always my favorite. The Amos and Andy stuff was great, but the Mel Blanc stuff was just priceless. The other guy that Jack, was part of his company and would come in from time to time, who I absolutely thought was hilarious, was Frank Nelson. Oh man, what a talented, funny guy. And again, a great ploy for Jack with the voice and the wheel. And I mean, Jack was always like, what the hell is this guy up to? But he was always doing that. See, these are all guys that Jack put around him that he could do all these reactions to. He's so smart. That was so smart.
Well, before we let you go, I want you to tell the Judy Garland story when you used to hang out in her kitchen for the audience. I think that's just a fun story.
Okay, I tell people from time to time, look, we grew up in this beautiful house. There was 3.5 acres, and around it, and around the property, were all these A-list movie stars. It's so ridiculous, our neighbors, that sometimes I tell people these stories and they don't even believe me. But Our neighbors were Alan Ladd, Lana Turner, who was married to Lex Barker, who was Tarzan. Then there was Judy Garland. This was when she was married to Sid Luft. At the house where Lorna and Joey and Liza was living there. Next to them were Humphrey Bogart and Laura Bacall, Cy Howard and Gloria Graham, Sammy Kahn, the songwriter, Art Linkletter, Walt Disney, Jerry Lewis, and Carol Burnett. Now people hear that and they go, no, come on. Absolutely true. But Judy had a stepson named Johnny Luft. This was Sid Luft's son. Johnny was my age, and we went to different schools, but every now and then I would come home, go over, jump the fence, and we were always welcome in each other's homes, and go up there and play football with him. Well, when The Wizard of Oz came on TV, it was a big deal. It was hosted by Danny Kaye. Maybe they had 2 commercial breaks. We'd have to ask our parents' permission to stay up and watch it. And by the way, the first 4 or 5 times I saw that movie, I thought it was a black and white movie because nobody had color TVs. So I had no idea it was a Technicolor movie. Anyway, I saw the movie on a Sunday night. I just loved it, of course. The next day, I went to school, and I came home from school, and I decided I'm going to go over and play with Johnny. So I went over there, and we were playing around, running around, as we always did. And we decided, let's get something to eat. So we went into the kitchen, and Judy was in the kitchen making soup. And she said, oh, hi, kids. How are you? You want some cookies or whatever we were having? I said, sure. So we're sitting there eating. Johnny, for some reason, got up and left to go upstairs for something. So I was in the kitchen alone with Judy Garland, and she was making soup, and I was eating cookies. And I said, Mrs. Luft, we would never think of saying, hey, Judy, because we had to be polite, so we called her Mrs. Luft. I said, I saw your movie last night, and I really liked it. She said, oh, great, honey. I think that's really great. And I don't know why, but I just went, hey, so can you sing me that song? And so she sang the first stanza of Over the Rainbow while I was in her kitchen, and she was making soup and I was eating cookies. It was just the 2 of us. And that's 100% true. That's one of the coolest things ever. Sometimes I tell people that and the story that we were standing 10 feet away from Walt Disney when he cut the ribbon at Disneyland. And they think either that's the coolest thing or this guy's crazy. But it's true. It's all true. It was all because of the people my dad knew in our neighborhood. And by the way, Judy was super nice, always sweet, always very supportive of me and Johnny, really sweet to Lorna and Joey and Liza as well. I never saw any bad side of her. I never saw any problems she had. And Sid Luft was also a really nice guy. He'd come up and throw the ball for us and everything like that. So I never had a problem with any of those people. As neighbors, they were A+.
Well, Rich, I always enjoy spending time with you. You're a delight, and thank you for your time today.
It's a pleasure, guys. Call me anytime you want. If you want to do some more stories, I'll think up some more and we'll talk some other time.
I will take you up on that offer. Don't you worry.
Okay, thanks, guys.
Mm-hmm.